Okay, everyone, why don't we get started? My name is Stefan Haggard. I direct the Korea Pacific program here at GPS. Of course, we're all virtual, but I'm really happy to be continuing the webinar series into the spring. And I just want to give you a foreshadowing of another webinar that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Celeste Arrington is the Korea Foundation Associate Professor at George Washington University and a terrific political scientist who's been working on legal issues in Korea surrounding public bads like regulating smoking. And so on February 28th, she's going to be talking about a new book she has with several of her colleagues on these topics. So an interesting change from what we've been doing. And also, of course, we'll be doing something on the elections as we get closer. But today, let me introduce one of my favorite political scientists of her generation, Ji-Yeon Hong, actually of any generation, Jean. I've known her for a number of years. She's an associate professor and the director of quantitative social analysis at Hong Kong University in the division of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, in the division of social sciences. She got her PhD from NYU, which is, those of you who are political scientists know this is one of the top political science departments in the country. And she just has a fantastically wide-ranging agenda of research that includes projects related to authoritarian rule, how autocrats gain support. And today she's going to be talking about an interesting topic that I call authoritarian nostalgia, which is why publics have this fondness for past dictators and what might determine that. But we also have an added benefit tonight because Jean is joined by Hyung-Ju Yang, who's a professor at Sogang University in the economics department. And so we're getting 2 for 1 this time out. And Hyun-Ju will let you, Jean will present and then you can take tough questions. And then finally, for those of you in political science, you know Ye-Lim Chung, who's a third-year graduate student here at the Department of Political Science, who's working on issues of polarization in South Korea. So Jean, why don't you go ahead and share your screen, talk for as long as you need, and then Ye-Lim will offer some comments.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Steph. Such a generous introduction. That's the kindest introduction I have ever got so far. So it's exciting to start my talk with the very nice introduction. So as Steph introduced, this is a paper basically about the legacy and nostalgia of previous dictator in South Korea, but we try to make a general contribution as well to the study of comparative politics. And it's, as mentioned, it's co-authored project with Hyun-Ju Yang, a rising star in economic history in South Korea, working at Sogang University, and Sunkyung Park at International University, another political scientist. And we have, we're trying to make other related projects on this because New Village Movement is not just a rural development project. It has other aspects and very good data in it. So if you have any other research idea, I would love to hear more about them. All right, so the general research question we are asking here is not just in Korea, but in many new democracy, we are seeing the rise of nostalgia about the past dictatorship. And then we are looking at this as an outcome of policy influence from the authoritarian government. So authoritarian government, unlike what many other people think, does not just repress. It also have a lot of policies that has not only have an impact in the short term during the authoritarian period, but also in the long run in the perhaps the country's history. And so I'm gonna skip this. We are in the Korean context, we are looking at the impact of the persistent impact of distributive policy under dictatorship. As obviously, we use the data from the New Village movement from the 1970s, and then link that with the election data during the 70s and also later period to find the short-term effect, obviously favoring the authoritarian incumbent party at the time. I'm saying authoritarian incumbent party because this is the period when there was no, sorry about this. Oh. Sorry. This is the period when there was no presidential election after the Shiwa Yushin. Okay, and then the long-term effect was also found in the election when the dictator's daughter ran as a Democratic presidential candidate. All right. And then what we are more proud of this project is we actually try to look at the mechanisms behind this nostalgia. So why people, many of them who resented the dictatorial period and ruling, why do they show support many decades later after democratic consolidation? So basically, we tested economic mechanism and also non-economic mechanism like social capital. What we found was these, it's not economic or non-economic benefits especially the rural residents had due to the New Village movement, but is more of psychological affinity and unwavering support they have for the former dictator that basically transited to the daughter. All right, so that's overall summary.
Jean, before you go to the next step, I just wanted to, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just reminding participants that if you do have questions, if you can put them into the Q&A, and if they're just clarificatory questions, I'll interrupt Jean and ask her to answer them. And if not, we'll pick them up at the end of the presentation. Thanks very much.
Okay, all right. So this slide is just showing that this is not just a phenomenon in Korea, but like we are looking at across all the continent, we are looking at the rise of former authoritarian parties and even the dictators or dictators' children rise up as democratic leaders and democratic political parties. So why do we see these legacies or rise of authoritarian successor parties? So the literature has been in three sort of big streams. And I'm not going to go into the details here because it has been because the talk has to be short, and we would like to focus more on the context of Korea. But the one literature focuses on democratization process. The process, it has been there has been a lot of concession, and it wasn't clear how much punishment has had to be done on the former dictatorial side. And the other stream of literature looked at the institutionalization. So a lot of institutionalization already went on during the authoritarian period, and then it was succeeded in the new democracy. So it could be through the party that has transformed itself quite well, or it could be the party which didn't even go through the transformation. And then most of these new democracies has a very weak institutionalized party system, and then that sort of helped the continuation of institutions that inherited from the authoritarian past. And the last stream of literature, which we also try to contribute most, is the voters' attitude. It's not just the party or the successor or the politicians themselves. It might be the attitude of the voters who especially have an experience in authoritarian past, they might have different conceptualization of politics and also democracy, or even different attitude about democracy. So our argument is that distributed policy, especially that targeted underprivileged population, has a persisting effect that on the beneficiaries, in not only in the short term but also in the long term. Let me skip the details of our argument here and then go to the hypothesis that we are trying to show, demonstrate in the paper. So in the short term, it's quite straightforward. We predict when there is a new increase in or larger new village movement subsidies, we expect the voters vote larger, the villagers cast larger share of votes to the authoritarian incumbent party. But in the long run, also, after many decades later, we expect the villages that received larger subsidies during the 1970s under the New Village Movement will cast larger share of votes to the dictator's party, or the politician who we call legacy politician in the paper, in the democratic election. And then we delve into what could be the mechanisms in this long-term effect, which is less clear than the short-term effect. We look into the economic mechanism, so whether these villages are richer today, so that's why they return the favor to the former dictator's daughter, or non-economic mechanism. And then we also look at the demographic changes in these villages, and finally the psychological mechanism. To spoil the fun later part, just in case we don't have, sorry, just to be clear, my son's school got a COVID case recently, and then the government officials and schools are calling us to get the mandatory test today. So sorry about the unexpected calls during the talk. We're gonna get tested right after this talk. To spoil the fun later part, we are looking, we couldn't find any support for the economic mechanism or non-economic mechanism. We found that the villages which get more support during the New Village Movement have more likely have less migration to the urban area, and then they have a very strong psychological affinity to the former dictator, which will show, I'll show the details later. All right, so New Village Movement, our case here in this project, is the largest rural development program in South Korea in the history. And then it began as a pilot project in early 70s and expanded into national campaign since 1973. And I don't have to remind this group of people about where Korea was at the time. It was one of the poorest countries, and about 60% of the population, according to the 1970 census, was the rural population. So this was the group, this was the scale of this project, this campaign at the time. New Village Movement was unique in a sense that it was driven by the government. It was rural development program driven by the government, but the core of the program was that it was run as a self-help campaign, and it aimed to provide the public goods to the village, which was very much lacking at the time, based on their own effort to provide. And government, depending on how much effort was put or how much self-help was put by the villagers, the government provides subsidies from the central to the village. So obviously the participants and also the beneficiary of this program was rural agricultural population. But another very crucial aspect of this program was this was during the very rapid industrialization and urbanization or manufacturization, which Professor Lee have a lot of things to say probably. also driven by the same government. So Park Chung-hee was not only doing the new village movement campaigning in rural village, but he was also the one who's building all the industrial complex and try to industrialize country from agricultural-based country to manufacturing-based country. So how was the process goes? The detailed projects and annual goals were set by the villagers themselves in the village meeting, headed by the head of the village or the new village movement leader. And villagers collectively work together to achieve those goals they set for that year. And their progress was evaluated by the local government. So each village have designated local government officials who trace or pressurize or follow up with the progress that villagers have been making. And based on that evaluation, compared to other neighboring villages, the subsidies will be allocated by the central government. And the next year, the cycle goes on. New goals are set, and then the collective work would have been made in the next year as well. This cycle continued until Park Chung-hee died in 1979, as we all know, by his long-term subordinate or friend, Kim Jae-gyu. Okay. So this, let me fill in with some more photos of the New Village movement, but this is how the New Village movement began. So it was the beginning was quite ad hoc. It was a government reaction or Park Chung-hee's reaction to the oversupply of cement. He basically decided to distribute the oversupplied cement to each village, the same amount to each village. And then the villagers decide how to use them on their own. Some village use it to build a common laundry area and well for all the villagers. But most of the villages were encouraged or suggested to use it to build the village road. Why? Because build and then enlarge and pave the village road, especially the main entry road, was very important for the adoption of mechanical cultivator at the time, which you see here. And then this mechanical cultivator was considered as a major technological advancement at the time from the cow-led the cultivation with traditional way of cultivation at that time. So you're looking at 2 generations of technology in the 1970s. And as you can also see here, the mechanical cultivator needed larger space for its movement, basically. And then pavement of the road and enlargement of the road was very, very necessary. And as another thing this photo shows is all the villagers, especially the males, had to participate in this movement. They had to put in their labor, of course, and then sometimes they also have to put their own finance, money, especially because government subsidies is not, it's not prevalent. It's not every year, it doesn't go to every village. So you have to put your own money. Sometimes you have to put your own land as well. If the land is right next to the old village road, and then the road has to be expanded, then there you are either need to donate or have to sell the land at a very cheap price for the village movement, successful village movement. Another very important context in this project is in this new village movement is the political context, where Park Chung-hee, who was trying to run for his 3rd term at the time, found a very strong rising star from the opposition side, whose name was Kim Dae-jung, in the presidential election. Of course, Park Chung-hee won, but the margin that he won was not large enough for authoritarian presidential election. And the next month, the month right after the presidential election, there was a legislative election where the opposition party marked an unprecedented success in terms of the share of votes and also seats. And then that was the background of the auto coup that Park did in 1972, Siwar Yushin in Korean. And he's what I would try to show you is that his auto coup and then the national launch of New Village movement almost overlapped. And then this is actually a photo that Hyunju found from the archive. This is a brochure about the auto coup or October reform, Siwar Yushin that Park Chung-hee did. This brochure was made by Ministry of Culture and Public Relations at the time, 문화공보부. And as you see, this brochure for the October reform is basically what the New Village movement tried to achieve, right? The new mechanical cultivator, wide road, very much organized cultivation area, new cars, 3 generations watching TV together in a very fancy, newly modeled house. And then the fact that the government used this photo as a bright future that the new October reform can bring shows what the New Village movement meant to the regime at the time. And then, as we know, almost 35 years, almost 40 years since the New Village movement, and about 25 years since the democratization of the country, Park Chung-hee's first daughter became the democratic president of South Korea. So this is the context that we are trying to look at. Finally, going to the empirics. So basically what we are trying to do is the resources that you got from the government at the time, how that affect the voting. Okay, and then the resources can mean two things. It can mean that you did New Village movement very more successfully than compared to other villages, because that was how you achieved the subsidy. And then it can also mean that you get more benefits from the government. So these two things are sort of proxied in this one measure. And then we get that information, and then the voting for the short term, we use the difference between 1973 and 1978 election, because the subsidies, the cash transfers, which we are measuring here, is basically during this period, and then the election was just before and after that period, and in the long run, 2012 election. This is the distribution of cash at the time per capita, per voter. And then as you see, a lot of people worry about the regionalism, but cash transfer at the time was not regionally defined. It's very much well scattered across the country. And then this is the regionalism that we are very much familiar with. This is the voting result of the 2012 support for Park Geun Hye at the time. And you see basically Gyeongsangbuk-do, Yeongnam, supporting Park Geun Hye very strongly, while Honam area, the support is quite weak. All right, so let me show you the result from the short term first. So this is the subsidies. Independent variable here is subsidies per voter in 1977, the year before the 1978 election. And then the dependent variable is how much the Park Chung-hee's party, Kongwadang, at the time got more votes compared to the previous election before the national expansion of New Village movement. And across the different statistical model, we find very strong support. What was interesting to us, I think this is subject to another interesting paper, is that when we look at each different years during this period within 1973 and 1978, only the year before the election has positive and statistically significant effect. All the other years, most of the year has positive effect, but it wasn't statistically significant. In the paper, we interpret this as a strategic behavior of authoritarian voters at the time, which I'm happy to elaborate. In the long run, we run regression as we mentioned using the 2012 incumbent Park Geun Hye's vote share as the dependent variable. And here we sum all the benefits, all the subsidies during this period, because the voters in 2012 has no incentive to differentiate this 74's subsidy to 77 subsidy. Here, in statistical test, we find again a little bit in terms of significance, it is weaker, but still very positive and statistically significant effect of New Village subsidies on Park Geun Hye's share, the daughter's share in 2012. And what's important here is we control Lee Myung-bak's share. In the one of the model, we controlled the Lee Myung-bak's share in 2007 election. So by controlling this, we are basically controlling the support from voters because she's from the conservative party that we support. Okay, so what we found here is what's in addition to the support for the conservative party, meaning what is specific to Park Geun Hye.
Hey, Jean, can I just ask a clarifying question that's coming from you? What is the unit of analysis here you want to ask? Is it the polling station, or is it the district, or the or?
That's a great question. So our village movement subsidy data was at the village level. And then we all know the election data is at the polling station level. There is no way we could match them together. So we matched them at the one level above, which is the township level, Eunmyeon-dong in Korea. And then there are about 3,000 Eunmyeon-dong level units in Korea. And then we are only looking at the rural units in 1970s, which end up giving us about 1,400 townships in the analysis. Sorry, I was rushing through the empirical strategy, so I missed the very important information. Thanks for the clarification question. All right, so we've done many robustness checks, but let me move to the mechanism analysis, which I think is the more interesting part here in this project. So why the rural villagers who benefited more from the New Village movement supported Park Chung-hee's daughter in a democratic election? We tested 4 different mechanisms, and then let me go one by one. So first thing we can think about is this was a developmental program. So if the village that worked well and then that received larger subsidies developed more, meaning that their income is higher than other rural villages. So all the baseline here is the other rural villages, all the urban districts are excluded in our analysis. Then it's rational for these villagers to support the daughter because they benefited economically. Unfortunately, there was no GDP data at the township or village level. So we used the nighttime luminosity intensity data, which a lot of economists use as a proxy for economic activities. Basically, we found the reverse. So the villages that did well during the New Village movement and got more subsidies have lower economic activity level today. And then we tested it over a long period from 1992 when this data, the nighttime luminosity data became available until the year before Park Geun Hye's election. And the the result is very consistently negative. So this shows us that beneficiary villages have less development or less economic activities today. But money is not everything, right? So there might be other non-monetary, non-economic benefits they could get from New Village movement. And we looked at social capita specifically because the way New Village movement was done is through collective action. So that could be potentially increase the social capita of the successful village, and then makes them live in a happier place in the long run. So we collected actually many different surveys looking at social capita in rural area today. And that includes their satisfaction, the residents' satisfaction in village life, interaction with other villagers, how much they participate in village activities, and how much they want to move out from the village, especially to urban district. And let me straightly go to the result. So this is the summary of the result. We have many other results on this social capita mechanism. Basically, we find no supporting evidence, statistically significant evidence, that these successful villages or the villagers have greater social capita. They're just not different from other rural villages in terms of how much they get satisfied or how much they interact with other villagers. So thirdly, we looked at the demographic and industrial structure of the village. We especially focused on the migration mechanism. So this is again the period when most of the large share of the rural population, especially young generation, moved to urban district as an unskilled labor, and then begin the manufacturization of the entire country. And inevitably, if your village is successful in New Village movement, and then even your household buy the mechanical cultivator, which needs a lot of investment, that highly likely make the villagers, and especially the young villagers, to stay in rural district, is your hometown, and invest your future in agriculture, because you already invested in, and then your village did well, your household did well. So that's the mechanism that we looked at. So these villagers must be more likely to stay in rural villages and remain in agriculture sector because of their initial investment in 1970s has already been made. And then this probably lead to more elderly population, because young generation in 1970s are those people who are around 60s, youngest, right? If you are 15 years old in 1970, you are 55 in 2010. So your village is more likely to have elderly population today. And basically throughout these statistical tests, what we found is these successful villages are more likely to focus on full-time farming, and also more likely to have larger share of elderly population. Finally, this is the last slide, I promise. Finally, these villagers, then we have to turn our question to, so what do they think differently? Are these so these are slightly more older, and then also more agriculture focused villagers, but that doesn't mean they would support Park Chung-hee for that reason, because agriculture is definitely not the core industry in Korea anymore, and most of the large share of the agriculture population are rather in the poor segment of the country. So we test whether these villagers have specific feelings about or specific evaluation, different evaluation about the politics or the former leaders. One of the survey we found was the survey called Survey of Korean Identity. And one of the, they have this set of questions where they ask the respondents how you evaluate the previous political leaders, previous and the present political leader. And basically what we found was the more subsidy you received in 1970s, they evaluate Park Chung-hee contributed to economic development significantly. And what was interesting was they believe Park Chung-hee also contributed to political development of the country. I'm reminding you that after the October reform, the democracy level of Korea was lowest in the country's history. So that was the lowest point in terms of democracy. But yet these people, these rural villagers who benefited more during the New Village movement believe in his political contribution. And this is only for Park Chung-hee here. The same survey asked the question about all the other presidents, including dictatorial and then also democratic presidents of the country. And none of the leaders have a special evaluation, high evaluation from these rural villagers. All right, so let me conclude with this photo. So what we saw was the evidence of long-term political legacy of authoritarianism. And in the comparative context, I think this was possible that the one very prominent former dictator's legacy inherit to his daughter specifically, not even through the political party, is related to the personalistic dictatorship that he had toward the end of his ruling. So he may begin as the military dictator, but especially after the October reform, he was increasingly becoming more personalistic, personal dictatorship. And then that makes the villagers or other population who benefited from the policy at the time believe this was his legacy rather than the regime's legacy or the party's legacy. And then that's why the legacy was inherited specifically to his family member rather than other members who worked in the same regime. Okay, let me conclude here. Thanks for your time, and then I look forward to your comments and questions. Staff, you are muted.
Sorry, you think I'd get used to doing this. If you can stop your share, Yaelin will put up her slide. Sure. But in the meantime, while she's doing that, let me just pose one question that's come in on the Q&A. You mentioned that people tend to stay if their households did well, but how do you reconcile the two findings? More people stayed in the New Village movement villages, despite their villages doing worse economically.
That's a really good question. So the economic evidence we found is only from 1990s. So these villages actually did better in 1970s, but that only lasts short term. And we all know the reason, because these villages' income increased this much, but national income increased so much more. So that's the short answer I can give now.
Right, great, thanks. You've got the floor.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Professor Hong and Professor Yang, for this fascinating research and for your talk, and to Professor Haggard for giving me this time to discuss. I'll keep my questions within 5 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. So to go straight in, first of all, what I found to be some of the many important contributions of this paper. First, I thought it really contributes to the broader literature and authoritarian legacies, like you mentioned, by raising the question of through which specific political actors are different possible types of authoritarian legacies being emanated from and being transmitted through. In the particular case of this movement in South Korea, the paper shows how this legacy was really specific to Park Chung-hee and endured as a political positive asset that got extended to his daughter rather than being transmitted through the conservative successor party or general support for political conservatism. That's the first important contribution that I got from the paper. Secondly, in context of the literature on void choice more broadly, specifically on valence versus performance components. The paper's finding that the effect of the subsidies were not being driven by villagers' long-term economic gains, I think shows really how valence components or affinity for a political leader can in certain contexts considerably outweigh economic performance factors, which was a question that was raised in the Q&A just now. I thought that was a really important contribution as well. And I also thought the choice of data and research design used to test these various potential micro-level mechanisms was really creative, and yeah, I learned a lot. Regarding the questions I had, it's more of questions rather than critiques, but first of all, as you all know, there's an existing literature on the roots and impact of regionalism as a political cleavage in South Korea. As you showed also through the maps of the election results, some suggest that it was during the Park Chung-hee era that regional divides were really politicized and became a significant political cleavage. Others suggest the roots go further back. Either way, for quite a long time, as we saw in the election results in 2012, the geographic distribution of election results have often shown considerable contrast between Honam and Yangnam. And I found the paper's use of instrumental variables and controlling for Im Young-bak's vote share in 2007 very convincing. Nevertheless, in the context of studies on regionalism in South Korea more broadly, some people might not find it very surprising that in the Hanam region, you found that these subsidies had a strong short-term effect, but not a long-term effect. But the opposite in Yangnam, not really a strong short-term effect, but a strong long-term effect that persisted even through 2012. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about where this paper is finding positions itself in the broader literature on regionalism in South Korea? Could the result be interpreted as differential motives across regions behind their vote choice? So a possible interpretation being that Hanam villages were more likely to be motivated to vote for the ruling party only if they could expect immediate returns in the form of these subsidies, while the support for Park and his daughter and Yeongnam were not really dependent in the first place on whether there were not immediate returns from the subsidies, and was perhaps more long-term in the form of sticky partisan attachments, political conservatism, or identity. So that's my first question.
Yeah,
and then, yes.
Just a question. Were you intending to move your slides? Because I'm just noticing that it's just fixed on your introductory slide, at least in my view.
Are you seeing the slide with regionalism in South Korea?
No.
No?
No.
That's strange. I'm seeing mine.
We're just seeing the title slide.
Sometimes when you go full screen, the share screen doesn't move.
Can you see it now?
We see.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Steph, for telling me. Yeah, that was my first slide. And my second question, which is kind of related possibly to my previous question, is the possible role of these village leaders. So the paper briefly talks about this, but doesn't really discuss the role of these village leaders. I was wondering if you could discuss a bit more about what their role might have been, if at all. So some really brief examples that I can think of or imagine is mediating or persuading villagers regarding potential sacrifices that villagers had to make, regarding potential distributional conflicts amidst these the NVM projects. And regarding related to somewhat possibly my previous question is, was support collectively organized and persuaded through these MVM village leaders? Did they play an important role in intervening and monitoring the vote choice, for example, or was it more individually motivated? So this is more of a question out of curiosity, if you were able to find evidence regarding that. And then my third question is, according to the paper, this particular legacy emanating from the movement is specific to Park Chung-hee as an individual political leader, and then extending to his daughter. So it's not a story about an authoritarian legacy coming from or being transmitted through the authoritarian successor party, a general support for political conservatism or ideology, partisanship, or policy preference. So my question is, if so, is this legacy of political affinity that came from these subsidies and the NVM toward Park Chung-hee and Park Geun Hye, is it now effectively dead since the impeachment and eventual imprisonment of Park Geun Hye? Do you know if these towns' support for Park Geun Hye persisted during the corruption scandal and candlelight protest period? I think that might be an interesting question if it hasn't been done yet. I'm wondering if these villages were perhaps more defensive, or did they also turn their back to Park Geun Hye at this time? So yeah, that's my question regarding potential individual resilience of political support towards leaders. So thank you.
Great questions, Yelim. Thanks very much for leading us off. Jean, do you want to take some or all of those? There are a couple questions in the chat, and then I want to ask you guys something too.
Sure. Go ahead. Excellent questions. Yeah. Oh, should I? Do you want me to answer Yaren's question first? Okay. These are absolutely crucial questions. So in terms of regionalism, we did. So our main so how we statistically first addresses our main specification is with the county fixed effect. So our comparison is basically within the same county or district, 시군구 level, the level right above the township. If your village get more subsidies, how your support is different from other villages in the township. So hopefully we hoped that addressed the regionalism issue to some extent. But as you notified that especially the long-term effect is much stronger in Yeongnam area. And then but when we look at the 70s voting outcome, the regionalism at the time was not evident. So in the 70s, the distribution of the subsidies were not regionally different, nor the election outcome was regionally driven. It was little there, but it's definitely not as in the rural area, not as strong as in 2012. And so we will argue regionalism in Korea has developed much more strongly during after the death of Park Chung-hee than during the period of Park Chung-hee. So that's sort of the other comment that I can have on the regionalism. But this is utterly important question that we should address further in the future. And then the role of village leaders, actually you pointed our next project. So we're trying to look at the clientelistic connection that you mentioned. So if you have specific type of, so we have all the information about the village leaders at the time. And we are trying to look at the variation in the village leaders and how that affects the election outcome in the short term and also in the long run. So one variation you can think of, if you have young village leaders at the time, maybe they still remain in the village and have an influence in later election after the democratization, while older village leaders probably cannot do it in recent elections. And about after the impeachment and scandal of Park Geun Hye, I mean this one I cannot speak confidently without looking at the evidence. But my personal feeling is that because the legacy was inherited to person, to personal dictator, to a very strong political leader with a strong persona, strong legacy, Park Geun Hye, her personal scandal, her individual scandal shattered a lot of political legacy of Park Chung-hee himself. And that's evident in the political rhetoric of the Conservative Party. They're trying to avoid Park Chung-hee, not only Park Geun Hye, but also Park Chung-hee as well. So they're not talking about the industrialization in their election. All they talk about is justice, fairness, all that, which does not connect directly to the previous dictatorship. So I think interestingly, the legacy of personalistic dictatorship is basically collapsed or broken by a person who inherited it. And then that's, I evaluate that's where Korean politics is standing today.
Great, great. Well, we've got a couple more questions, but let me ask one that worries me a little bit, and it has to do with the determinants of the level of subsidy. So imagine two different models of, what level of subsidy a village gets. Under one, this is an automatic calculation based on some measure of own effort. And so higher subsidies reflect higher village effort, which of course may be a function of a whole series of other things. And so, you've got some interesting potential selection problems there.
Yes.
But then at the other extreme, imagine an authoritarian politician who basically allocates subsidies strategically for some electoral purpose. It could be a swing district, it could be providing resources to supporters. And you said in passing, Jean, that the level of subsidy is a function of both of these things, but it makes a big difference, which it is.
Yeah.
Because if this is a proxy for village own effort, then what you're really talking about is some, unspecified feature of that village.
Sorry.
That makes it successful.
Yeah.
Right, in getting subsidies.
Mm-hmm.
So does that have any effect on the identification strategy here, that there's ambiguity about what the level of subsidy is capturing?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a absolutely important question. So that's so first of all, sorry. So government is trying to get us into mandatory test appointment. So sorry about that. So what's how we address that is so in the paper we were like, so we tested whether the previous election outcome affected the subsidy level,
Right.
and especially the earlier period, so 1974, 75, the subsidies were affected by the 1973 election. That's why we subtract 1973's share from 1978 share in the short-term analysis. And so this is what we look at in the short term is the change between 1973 to 78. And so this is whatever support the village have had before the New Village movement, and that probably affected the initial allocation of subsidies at the beginning. We already considered that in the analysis, and then we're looking at the change on top of it. But you're absolutely right in that regard. And that's why we only see the 1977 subsidies affecting the 1978 election, the gap between 1973 election, but not the earlier period of the allocation.
Also, let me add, so as you mentioned, whether it's merit-based or not, the cash transfers. So it was publicly known at the time that you had to do, let's say, widen the roads like 500 meters or something in order to receive funding from the government. So, well, unofficially it was merit-based. So the distribution is based on very specific conditions, quantified conditions.
Right. No, I understand that, but let's say that it's perfectly given by that formula, basically. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that mean, though, that variable is a proxy for some feature of village level organization?
Yeah, could be,
so
could be. Yeah,
I'm trying to get my head around what the implications of that
right,
are.
Right.
What's your
right,
model like?
Right.
Effectively, how good are villages at getting subsidies?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And you're saying that the villages which are good at getting subsidies actually vote for Park Chung-hee in the short run and for Park Geun Hye in the long run. But what is it that makes villages good at getting subsidies?
Definitely.
I mean, it's almost like sort of like a Munsub help me. I mean, this is sort of like a selection problem, isn't it?
Yes. It's definitely there. That's why we tried the instrumental variable. We try to control the 1960s census data, so the population size, like, which could be the proxy of the development before the movement began. So, but still, it doesn't directly answer your question that there might be some difference across these villages before everything began, even before Park Chung-hee, right? And then that might affect the level of the success of the movement, and also subsidy, and also support for Park Chung-hee.
Also, So effectively, we are first differencing the, so in our specification, we are first differencing, basically we use delta. So, if at the township level, if something that affects the village performance that does not change over time. So I think these are something we can control for. But if it's dynamically changing, then yes, we still have the issue, as you mentioned.
I'm not sure, because I think like a delta in the subsidies could reflect something that happens between, T and T5 plus 5, right? So maybe some villages manage to get themselves organized in some way. I don't want to monopolize the time. I've got a couple of other questions here. And Munsuk, if you want to get in, please just raise your hand or jump in. Someone asks this very interesting question. Do you think that the assassination of Park helped to cement him in the minds of the villagers and Koreans as a larger than life hero?
Yeah.
And if he'd been terminated by, as a result of an election or some, other exit.
Very, very fair question. I would say to some extent, yes, because he was in, the next leader was not democratic leader, and but another dictator. So Park Chung-hee never went through what we call transitional justice in comparative politics. So that sort of protected his legacy much better than the next leader, Chun Doo-hwan's legacy. So Chun Doo-hwan went through some transitional justice under Kim Young-sam, right? He was in prison for the coup that he did in 1980, basically, 79, basically. But Park Chung-hee, who also began his regime with the coup, never went through any sort of this transitional justice. And partly it's because he was assassinated rather than removed by other means.
Right. Munso, get in. And then I have one last question to pose to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is really fascinating work. I mean, I don't have the right to write down on the Q&A, but I know that Hyunju Yang was typing the answer. So let me ask one quick question. So I find this across the village variation within a county is really convincing. But so my question is, so you're comparing the voting share in the treatment group compared to the control group. So this is the comparison between the two villages. So I wonder if your research can tell anything about the aggregate effect by just putting the cash transfer to the economy per se. So whether that could increase the voting share for Park. So because it's possible that the voting share decreased in the control group, the villages who were unfortunate to get very little money in this program.
I don't know. My first impression is it's hard to answer at the aggregate level, partly because the regionalism that Yerim mentioned. The effect is very strong in some provinces, but not as strong in some provinces, like in other provinces like Honam area. So that's something that I can only answer after looking at the data. Hyunju, you have some initial thoughts about Munsup's question?
I'm sorry, I was writing the answer from the chat window, so I missed it. But I'll talk to Munsup afterwards, and we can discuss. Sorry.
Okay. So we've got one last question, because I promised people that we get off shortly after. It's been a wonderful seminar. Minju Kim asks about handling electoral redistricting. This is kind of a technical issue, but for those of you who are doing this kind of data work, it's a pain in the neck. So how do you handle the fact that, districts are merged, rural villages over the last 40 years have disappeared, the relatively poor and empty villages are merged for administrative purposes, does that enlarge the long-term electoral effect in favor of your demographic mechanism because of just the changing of district boundaries?
Yeah, I know how much pain that could be.
Wow.
Yes. I think Hyunju can answer this question more properly, but we did manual matching. A lot of labor intensive and hurt our eyes. And then we also use GIS to calculate how much overlapping exists across the boundary reform. But Hyunju, do you want to add anything how we match the 1970s to 2012?
So we use the boundary maps, GIA maps, and also we look at the laws. Whenever there's admin changes, it has to be recorded in the government's as a law. So we look at that as well to track the how the villages evolved into something else, and also look at the Wikipedia and all these things to cross-check. So yeah, it was, I think, the most painful and time
When I saw that question, I knew that there's a lot of
Still, we
pain.
had to drop a lot of some district, like 10%. Yeah, because of there's no way we could match those districts. Yes.
That's one of the hardest tasks. Well, listen, this has just been absolutely fantastic. Jean, with your permission, and Hyunju, can I offer to circulate the paper to those who are on the webinar?
Sure.
Yeah, great. So if you're interested in
Yeah.
seeing this terrific paper, just contact me or Ye Lim. We have copies and we can send them out. And Jean and Hyunju, it was a particular pleasure having you on because we didn't anticipate it. So that's great. And we hope to have both of you back again sometime. And look forward to seeing you on February 28th, where we'll do something on a regulation of smoking in Korea and Japan. It's a very interesting public health topic by political scientist Celeste Arrington. And then we'll get someone to talk to us about elections after the presidential election. I think we'll do it after. So great seeing everyone, and so long. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.